The cream-colored envelope felt heavier than a tombstone in my hands. The calligraphy was exquisite, looping Julian's name with another woman's in a delicate silver dance. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a summons. Inside, nestled against the formal request for my presence, was a personal handwritten note from him. He wasn't just inviting me to his wedding, he wanted me to be the wedding singer. He wanted me to stand before everyone we ever knew and perform the soundtrack to his new beginning, built directly on the ashes of ours. And the worst part, I knew I couldn't say no. The eviction notice was taped to my apartment door, a stark white rectangle against the peeling brown paint. It felt less like a notice and more like a final, damning judgment. 3 months overdue. I tore it down, the paper crinkling in my fist, a sound that echoed the brittle state of my finances and my spirit. Inside, my small apartment in Chicago's Logan Square was a landscape of my stalled life. My keyboard, a second-hand Yamaha, sat in the corner, gathering a thin film of dust. Sheet music and unpaid bills coexisted in precarious stacks on the coffee table. This was the reality Julian Thorne had left me in, a world away from the one we once shared. Just a year ago, I was Ilara Vance, the promising singer-songwriter, the muse to Julian Thorne, heir to the Thorne Industries fortune. We were the couple people envied, the artist and the aristocrat, a modern-day fairy tale set against the glittering backdrop of Chicago's elite. He'd found me at an open mic night at the Green Mill, a smoky, historic jazz club where I poured my soul into 3-minute songs for a handful of indifferent patrons. He'd seen something in me, he'd said, a fire that deserved a bigger stage. For 2 years, he was that stage. He funded my demos, connected me with producers, and filled the front row of every show with his influential friends. He didn't just support my dream, he became its architect. And I, blinded by love and gratitude, hadn't realized he was also building its cage. The breakup was as swift and brutal as an amputation. There was no argument, no dramatic final scene. Just a quiet, sterile conversation in his cavernous, art-filled penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. "It's just not working, Ilara," he'd said, his voice as smooth and emotionless as the marble countertops. He spoke of diverging paths and different priorities, corporate speak for, "You're no longer a good investment." He'd already moved on, I would later learn, to Isabel Sterling, a woman from his own world, whose father sat on the board of his company. My key card to the penthouse was deactivated the next day. The producers stopped returning my calls. The fairy tale was over. Now, holding this invitation, the past came crashing back with the force of a physical blow. Isabel Sterling. Of course, she was perfect for him, polished, pedigreed, and pliable. I sank onto my lumpy sofa, the crinkled eviction notice a hot, sweaty ball in my palm. The invitation itself was a work of art, thick cardstock with silver leaf and the scent of expensive perfume. It felt obscene in my struggling artist apartment. Then I saw his note tucked inside on a smaller card, his familiar sharp handwriting a stiletto to the heart. "Ilara, I know this is unexpected, but as I and Isabel plan our special day, we keep coming back to the music. And when I think of music, I still think of you. Your voice was the soundtrack to a very important chapter of my life. It would mean the world to us if you would perform at our ceremony. The song we had in mind is our Northern Star. We can, of course, discuss your professional fee. I know things have been difficult for you lately. Yours, Julian." The rage came first, a hot, coppery taste in my mouth. Our Northern Star. The song I wrote for him on our first anniversary, a deeply personal ballad about finding your one constant point in a spinning world. He wanted me to sing our song as he married another woman. It wasn't a request. It was a power play, a final cruel twist of the knife, and he knew it. The casual mention of my difficult situation was the salt in the wound. He wasn't just offering me a gig. He was offering me a lifeline, knowing full well he was the one who had pushed me overboard. My best friend Maya, a fiery-haired tattoo artist with zero tolerance for bullshit, was on the phone 2 minutes later. "You have to be kidding me," she seethed after I read her the note. "This is next-level psychological warfare, Ilara. He's not just your ex, he's your former patron, your former landlord, your former everything. He's a puppeteer, and he just found your strings again. You cannot do this." "I have to, Maya," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "The fee he's offering, it would cover my rent for a year. It would get me out of this hole. I can record a new EP. I can start over." "At what cost? Your dignity? Your sanity?" "What dignity is there in being homeless?" I shot back, my voice cracking. "He has all the power here. He knows it. He's cornered me and he's enjoying the view." The truth of it settled in my bones, cold and heavy. This wasn't just about money. Julian wasn't just flexing his financial muscle. He was asserting his continued ownership of my talent, of my art, of the most intimate parts of my past. He needed to prove to me and to everyone else that even after everything, I was still his to command. My voice, the one thing I had left that was truly mine, was just another asset he could purchase. The power imbalance was a chasm between us. He stood on one side atop his corporate empire, while I teetered on the edge of ruin on the other. He had systematically dismantled the career he'd pretended to build for me, ensuring I was left with nothing. No contacts, no money, no confidence. He hadn't just broken my heart, he had tried to break my spirit. Now he was offering a gilded cage as a solution to the poverty he himself had orchestrated. I smoothed out the eviction notice on the coffee table. The black, impersonal letters stared up at me. Then I looked at the elegant invitation. One was a threat, the other a twisted sort of salvation. But they both felt like chains. That night, sleep offered no escape. I dreamt of standing on a vast, empty stage. A single spotlight pinned me down. An audience of masked faces watched in silence. Julian was in the front row, holding Isabel's hand, a smug, satisfied smile on his face. I opened my mouth to sing, but no sound came out. My voice was gone. He had taken that too. I woke up in a cold sweat, the dream clinging to me like a shroud. A decision had formed in the dark, desolate hours of the night, a tiny, hard kernel of something that felt dangerously like a plan. If Julian Thorne wanted a performance, I would give him one. He wanted to own my voice, to put it on display as a trophy of his conquest. He thought he knew the song. He thought he knew the singer. But he had no idea what I was capable of. He had left me with nothing to lose, and in doing so had given me a strange, terrifying kind of freedom. I would sing at his wedding, but I would not be singing his song. I would be singing mine. The memory of how it all began was a ghost that haunted the corners of my cramped apartment. It was a cruel counterpoint to the present, a reminder of a time when Julian Thorne's attention felt like sunshine, not a spotlight. 2.5 years ago, the Green Mill was my church. I'd take the stage, bathed in the dim, honey-colored light, the smell of old wood, stale beer, and history thick in the air. I wasn't singing for fame or money then. I was singing because it was the only way I knew how to breathe. That night, I sang an original Cobblestone Heart, a raw, bluesy number about the walls we build around ourselves. My voice, a little husky from a lingering cold, filled the room, and for a few minutes the usual clinking of glasses and low hum of conversation quieted. When I finished, the applause was polite, standard for a Tuesday night. But as I stepped off the small stage, a man stood from a table in the shadows. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car. He moved with an unnerving stillness, a predator's grace. "Ilara Vance," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the air between us. It wasn't a question. "I'm Julian Thorne." Of course I knew who he was. Everyone in Chicago knew. Thorn Industries was a behemoth, its logo stamped on skyscrapers, philanthropic galas and political campaigns. He was the city's crown prince, rarely seen in places as beautifully gritty as the Green Mill. "Your voice," he continued, his dark eyes intense, analytical. "It has texture. It tells a story before the lyrics even begin. It's a crime that you're singing to a room of ghosts." I was floored, disarmed by the directness, the sheer force of his presence. "We all have to start somewhere," I managed, clutching my guitar case like a shield. "Starting is for amateurs," he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Talent like yours should be launched. What do you want, Ilara? Truly want?" No one had ever asked me that so directly. Not my parents, not my friends. I mumbled something about just wanting to play my music, to connect with people. "Think bigger," he commanded, not unkindly. He handed me a business card, the stock so thick it felt like a credit card. "Call me tomorrow. I have some people I think you should meet." And just like that, he was gone, leaving a faint scent of expensive cologne and the crackling energy of possibility in his wake. That was the beginning. He swept into my life like a force of nature, rearranging everything. Within a month, I was out of my dingy walk-up and living in a chic apartment in River North that he paid for. He called it an artist's stipend, a way for me to focus solely on my music without the distraction of waiting tables. He introduced me to legendary producers, A&R executives, and session musicians I had only ever read about. He bought me a vintage Martin guitar, telling me my music deserved to be played on an instrument with a soul. He was intoxicating. He was brilliant, driven, and utterly captivated by my art. He'd sit for hours in the studio, just listening, his focus absolute. He'd dissect my lyrics, not to criticize but to understand, to find the deeper meaning I'd hidden between the lines. He made me feel seen, not just as a singer but as an artist. My creativity bloomed under his attention. I wrote a torrent of new songs, each one better than the last, fueled by the dizzying romance and the belief that I had finally found my place in the world. Our northern star was born one rainy April night in his penthouse. We were curled up on a white leather sofa, the city lights a glittering tapestry below. I had been playing with a melody on my new guitar, and the words just flowed out, a pure, unfiltered expression of my love for him. He was my constant, my fixed point in a world that had suddenly started spinning at a dizzying pace. When I finished, his eyes were shining. He kissed me, a deep, possessive kiss that left me breathless. "That song, Ilara," he whispered against my lips. "That's ours, forever." But looking back now through the clear, painful lens of hindsight, the red flags were there, fluttering at the edges of the perfect picture he'd painted. They were subtle at first, a suggestion to change a lyric because it was too revealing, a comment about my stage outfit being a little too desperate for attention. He'd frame it all as professional advice, a strategy for building my brand. He was the businessman after all. He knew how to sell a product. And I, it seemed, was the product. The cage, though golden, began to reveal its bars. He discouraged my friendships with other local musicians, calling them amateur distractions. He convinced me to stop playing at small clubs like the Green Mill, arguing that it devalued my brand to perform for free. My world, once sprawling and messy and filled with my own choices, began to shrink until it contained only him and the career he was designing for me. The power imbalance was a slow, creeping poison. He wasn't just my boyfriend, he was my benefactor. Every meal, every piece of equipment, every opportunity was a gift from him. It created a debt I could never repay, a sense of obligation that silenced the small, dissenting voice inside me. I started writing songs I thought he would like, choosing melodies I thought were more marketable. The raw, honest musician from the Green Mill was being polished, packaged, and tamed. The final chilling sign came about 6 months before the end. A major record label had expressed serious interest. An executive, a woman named Clara, wanted to fly me out to LA to discuss a deal. I was ecstatic, bouncing off the walls with excitement. This was it, the dream. Julian's reaction was lukewarm. "It's a good first step," he said, reviewing the email over my shoulder. "But they'll try to own you, Ilara. They'll change your sound, control your image. We need to be careful." He insisted on handling all the negotiations himself. He flew to LA alone. He came back a week later with a grim look on his face. "The deal wasn't right," he announced. "They wanted complete creative control. I turned it down. For you." I was devastated, but I trusted him. He was protecting me, I thought. He was keeping my art pure. It was only after he left me, when I tried to contact Clara at the label myself, that I learned the truth. Her assistant informed me that Clara had left the company months ago. When I finally tracked Clara down on LinkedIn, her response to my message was polite but confusing. "I'm sorry, Ilara," she wrote. "We were very excited about you, but your manager, Mr. Thorne, informed us you had decided to take an indefinite hiatus from music to focus on your personal life. We were sorry to lose you." The blood drained from my face as I read the message. An indefinite hiatus. He hadn't protected me. He had sabotaged me. He had never intended for me to be launched. He only wanted me to be his. My success, if it wasn't mediated and controlled by him, was a threat. He hadn't been building me a stage. He'd been building a beautiful soundproof box where I would sing only for him. And when he grew tired of his songbird, he simply opened the door and pushed me out into the cold, taking the cage and the key with him. He had stripped me of my contacts, my confidence, and my career, leaving me with nothing but the ghost of a dream. And now he wanted one last command performance. He wanted to see his songbird perform on cue one more time, just to prove she still knew who her master was. The days leading up to the wedding were a strange purgatory. Julian, ever the efficient businessman, had his assistant, a brisk woman named Caroline, arrange the details. A check with a staggering number of zeros was messengered to my apartment. The first half of my professional fee. It arrived in a Thorne Industries envelope, and as I signed for it, I felt a familiar cocktail of shame and relief. The check sat on my kitchen counter for a full day before I could bring myself to deposit it via my banking app. The moment the funds cleared, a weight I hadn't even fully realized I was carrying lifted from my shoulders. I paid my 3 months of back rent, my utility bills, my credit card debt. I bought a week's worth of groceries without checking the price of every item. For the first time in a year, I could breathe. But the air I was breathing felt tainted, bought and paid for by my humiliation. Caroline also sent over a schedule and a contract. The contract was ironclad, stipulating the song, Our Northern Star, and the performance time. There was even a dress code. Subtle elegance, muted tones. They didn't want the help upstaging the bride. The schedule detailed a single rehearsal at the venue the day before the wedding. My name was listed not as Ilara Vance, but as ceremony vocalist. I was an invoice number, a line item in a multi-million-dollar wedding budget. My evenings were spent in a battle with myself. I'd sit at my dusty Yamaha keyboard, my fingers hovering over the keys. I needed to rehearse, to find a way to sing Our Northern Star without my voice breaking, without choking on the memories embedded in every note. Playing the opening chords was like pressing on a bruise. The melody, once a source of comfort and joy, now felt mocking. The lyrics I had written with such sincerity, like a sailor lost at sea, I chart my course by what you are to me, were now a bitter irony. He was no one's northern star. He was a black hole, pulling everything into his orbit and crushing it. I tried to sing it, but the words caught in my throat. My voice, my only real asset, betrayed me. It came out thin and shaky, a ghost of its former self. After a dozen failed attempts, I slammed my hands on the keys, the dissonant chords screaming into the quiet apartment. I couldn't do it. I couldn't sing his lies. That's when I turned to the new song. It had been living inside me for months, a tangled knot of grief and rage I couldn't unravel. It had no name, just a collection of lyrical fragments and a haunting minor-key melody that came to me in dreams. Now, it felt like the only true thing I had left to say. Writing it became my secret act of rebellion. Late at night, with the city asleep, I would sit at the keyboard and let it all pour out. I didn't write an angry diatribe or a predictable revenge anthem. That's what he would expect. That would make me the crazy, bitter ex-girlfriend. No, this had to be smarter, sharper. It had to be a story, told with such grace and quiet devastation that the truth would be undeniable. I wrote about a master architect who built a beautiful house for a rare bird. I wrote about how he lined the cage with gold and velvet, and how the bird sang for him, thinking the house was a home, that the cage was a throne. I didn't use his name, I didn't use mine. I used metaphor and allegory, crafting lyrics that could be interpreted in multiple ways, but whose real meaning would be crystal clear to him, and, I hoped, to anyone who was really listening. The final verse was the hardest to write. It wasn't about anger, it was about release. This golden cage, it cannot hold a thing it didn't buy, the architect. He owns the house, but he will never own the sky. And tonight my wings remember how it feels to truly fly. It was a declaration of independence, a quiet reclaiming of my own narrative. As I pieced the song together, I felt a flicker of the old Ilara, the girl from the green mill, returning. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but now it was joined by something else, a fierce, defiant resolve. Maya came over one evening with a bottle of cheap red wine and 2 plastic cups. She found me hunched over the keyboard, scribbling lyrics on a napkin. She listened quietly as I explained my plan, her expression shifting from worry to a kind of awed respect. "You're a goddamn warrior, you know that," she said, pouring the wine. "But Ilara, are you ready for the fallout? This isn't just Julian. This is his family, his company, his entire world. They will close ranks. They could ruin you." "He already did ruin me," I said, my voice steady. "Or he tried to. The worst has already happened. All I have left is my story. He wants a performance. He's paying me to stand on a stage with a microphone in front of all the people whose opinions he cares about. He's handing me the weapon and pointing it at his own chest. I'd be a fool not to pull the trigger." "It's not a trigger," Maya said softly, her eyes searching mine. "It's a key to let yourself out of that cage for good." Her words resonated deep within me. She was right. This wasn't about revenge, not really. Revenge was about hurting him. This was about healing me. It was about taking the narrative he had tried to control and writing my own ending. The rehearsal was at the wedding venue, a sprawling, historic estate on the North Shore, overlooking a turbulent Grey Lake, Michigan. The ballroom was breathtaking, with floor-to-ceiling windows, crystal chandeliers, and an army of florists arranging mountains of white roses. I felt small and shabby in my jeans and sweater. Julian was there, standing with Isabel and her mother. He looked impossibly handsome in a cashmere sweater, the picture of relaxed wealth. Isabel was a porcelain doll, beautiful and fragile, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She gave me a brief, dismissive glance before turning back to the florist. Julian walked over to me, his familiar cologne preceding him. "Ilara, glad you could make it." His tone was proprietary, as if I were a caterer he had hired. "The check cleared," I said, my voice flat. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before he masked it with a charming smile. "Good. We just want everything to be perfect. No surprises." He looked me directly in the eye, his gaze a warning. "Just the song we discussed. It means a lot to Isabel." The lie was so effortless, so smooth, it almost took my breath away. He was using her as a shield, hiding his own cruel sentimentality behind his fiancé's supposed wishes. "Don't worry, Julian," I said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "It will be a performance no one will ever forget." I walked to the small stage where the string quartet was setting up. I ran through the first verse and chorus of our northern star, for the sound tech. My voice was clear and controlled. I sang the words, but they felt like a foreign language. My heart wasn't in them. It was somewhere else, waiting in the wings, clutching the new lyrics, the true lyrics, ready for opening night. As the empty, pretty notes of the song echoed in the vast, empty ballroom, I saw Julian nod in satisfaction. He turned back to his bride-to-be, squeezing her hand. He had heard what he wanted to hear. He had no idea he was applauding his own executioner. The day of the wedding arrived with a sky the color of a bruised pearl. A chilled, damp wind blew in off the lake, rattling the windows of the historic estate and making the perfectly manicured gardens seem bleak and unwelcoming. It felt fitting. I was given a small, sterile room in the staff wing to prepare, a green room that was more like a closet, with a single chair and a mirror framed with bare, unforgiving light bulbs. It was a world away from the lavish bridal suite where Isabel and her flock of bridesmaids were being pampered. From my window, I could see the guests arriving, a river of dark suits and jewel-toned dresses flowing into the grand entrance. They were the titans of Chicago's financial and social scenes, the people Julian had paraded me in front of when I was his pet project. Now I was just the hired help, invisible. I wore the dress I had bought with his money, a simple, long-sleeved column of dark charcoal silk. It was elegant and understated, perfectly adhering to the muted tones requested in the contract. My hair was pulled back in a low, simple knot. My makeup was minimal. I wanted to be a blank canvas. I wanted the only thing people to see, to hear, to remember, to be the song. The knot of fear in my stomach had tightened into a cold, hard stone. What if my voice failed me? What if I lost my nerve? What if they just cut my mic? Maya's words echoed in my head. They could ruin you. But then I thought of the eviction notice, of the soul-crushing year of rejections, of the casual, devastating cruelty in Julian's note. He had built his new life on the rubble of mine. He deserved to have the ghost of that destruction pay him one last visit. A wedding coordinator with a headset and a clipboard knocked sharply on my door. 5 minutes, ceremony vocalist. My heart hammered against my ribs. I walked through a maze of back hallways, the scent of expensive perfume and hothouse flowers growing stronger with every step. I could hear the low hum of hundreds of conversations, the clinking of champagne glasses. Then I was standing in the wings of the grand ballroom, hidden behind a velvet curtain, looking out at the scene. It was more opulent than I could have imagined. The chandeliers dripped with crystals, casting a warm golden light over the sea of faces. The aisle was a carpet of white rose petals. At the end of it, on a raised dais, stood Julian. He looked regal and confident in his custom tuxedo, a king in his court. He was smiling, but it was his public smile, the one he used for cameras and shareholders, charming but with no real warmth. He was performing just as much as I was about to. The string quartet began to play. The procession started. I watched the bridesmaids float down the aisle, followed by the flower girls. Then the music swelled, and everyone stood. Isabel appeared at the far end of the ballroom, a vision in white lace and diamonds clinging to her father's arm. She was beautiful, undeniably, but as she walked towards her future husband, her eyes fixed on him, I saw a flicker of something in her expression. Not just joy, but a kind of anxious possession, the look of someone who has finally won a coveted prize and is terrified it might be taken away. They stood together on the dais, holding hands. The officiant began to speak, his voice droning on about love and partnership. I didn't listen to the words. I watched Julian. He looked at Isabel, but his eyes seemed to be looking right through her. He squeezed her hand at the right moments, smiled when he was supposed to, but there was a disconnect, a hollowness to his actions. I realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that this marriage was not about love for him. It was a merger. Isabel Sterling was not his partner. She was an acquisition, the perfect pedigree-approved accessory to complete the image of Julian Thorne, the powerful, successful scion. And me? I was the final flourish. Forcing his broken-hearted ex to sing at his wedding was the ultimate demonstration of his power. It was a message to everyone, and especially to me. I own it all. Your art, your heart, your past, it all belongs to me. Then it was my time. The officiant announced, "And now, a special musical performance, a song chosen by the couple to commemorate their union." I stepped out from behind the curtain and walked to the microphone at the side of the stage. A single soft spotlight found me. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes turning in my direction. I didn't scan the crowd. I didn't look for anyone I knew. I looked directly at Julian. Our eyes met across the cavernous room. For a split second, his charming smile faltered. He hadn't expected me to look at him, to challenge him with my gaze. He expected me to be a demure, sad little prop. I saw a flicker of surprise, then annoyance, before he smoothed it over, turning his attention back to his bride. But I knew he was still watching me from the corner of his eye. The pianist with the string quartet began the simple, familiar opening chords of Our Northern Star. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My palms were slick with sweat. I took a deep, steadying breath, gripping the microphone stand until my knuckles were white. This was it, the point of no return. I opened my mouth and began to sing. The first verse was exactly as he remembered it. My voice, clear and pure, filled the silent room. In a world that spins too fast, in a love I thought would last, you were the stillness in the air, a silent promise, an answered prayer. I sang the words with a detached, melancholy precision. I saw Julian relax, a faint, smug smile touching his lips. He squeezed Isabel's hand, whispering something in her ear, probably telling her this was the song his little protégé had written for him. He thought he had won. He thought the performance was going exactly according to his script. I sang the first chorus, my eyes still locked on his. You are my northern star, my steady guiding light, the one true thing that's burning in the blackest of the night. And then, as the last note of the chorus hung in the air, the pianist, following the secret instructions I had given him during our brief rehearsal, shifted. The melody changed. The key dropped into a haunting, unfamiliar minor. The tempo slowed to a funereal pace. I saw the confusion on Julian's face, a slight furrow in his brow. He looked from me to the pianist and back again. The guests began to murmur, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Isabel's perfect smile wavered. I took another breath, and as the new melody began, I closed my eyes for a moment, letting go of the fear. I was no longer the ceremony vocalist. I was Ilara Vance, and this was my story. I opened my eyes, looked directly at Julian Thorne, and began to sing the truth. The shift in the music was a palpable thing, a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure that made the air in the grand ballroom feel thick and heavy. The sweet, predictable melody of Our Northern Star dissolved, replaced by a sparse, melancholic piano line that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. The murmuring from the guests grew for a moment, a wave of confusion, before a profound, expectant silence fell over the room. Every eye was on me, but I was only looking at one person. Julian's face was a mask of controlled fury. His eyes, which had been so smug moments before, were now narrowed, dark slits of disbelief. His hand, holding Isabel's, tightened, and I saw her flinch almost imperceptibly. He knew. In that instant, he knew this was not a mistake. This was a coup. My voice, when it came, was different. It was no longer the clear, polished instrument he had tried to cultivate. It was raw, imbued with the husky texture of pain and resilience, the voice of the girl from the green mill, resurrected. There once was an architect of marvelous design, I began, my voice low and steady, each word a carefully placed stone, who found a bird and told her, "Your sweet song will now be mine." The allegorical nature of the lyrics was my shield and my sword. It wasn't a direct accusation, but a story, a dark fairy tale unfolding in real time. I could see the guests exchanging puzzled glances. They were trying to place the song, to understand the sudden somber turn. He built a cage of twisted gold and swore it was a throne. He clipped her wings and told her, "You will never sing alone." He filled her dish with diamonds, so she'd never have to look at the lonely, starving artists in the pages of his book. Julian's knuckles were white where he gripped Isabel's hand. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle flexing from across the room. He was trapped. To stop me now, to cause a scene, would be to admit the truth of the song. He had to stand there and take it. His perfect wedding day turning into a public indictment, with his bride and all of his esteemed guests as the jury. I watched Isabel. The color had drained from her face. Her eyes darted from Julian to me and back again, a dawning horror in her expression. Was this the first crack she was seeing in his perfect facade? Or was it the first time she was being forced to acknowledge something she had long suspected? The prize she had won was beginning to look tarnished. The second verse came, my voice gaining strength and conviction. The bird, she sang him love songs, for she knew no other tune beneath the fabricated sun, the artificial moon. He showed her off at parties, a jewel upon his wrist, a pretty living trophy, whose own soul he had dismissed. This time there were audible gasps. I saw Julian's mother, a formidable woman in dove-grey silk, put a hand to her chest. Several of Julian's business partners, men who had seen me on his arm at countless events, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were connecting the dots. The pretty living trophy was standing right in front of them, singing her testimony. The string quartet, following the new sheet music I'd given their pianist, swelled behind me, adding a layer of tragic grandeur to the melody. The music was a mournful tide, and my voice was the lonely ship upon it. I was no longer just singing, I was testifying. My personal heartbreak was transforming into a universal story of control, of power, of being silenced. Then came the bridge, the moment where the story turned from the past to the present. My voice dropped to an almost whisper, forcing everyone to lean in, to hang on every word. But cages, they grow rusted, and silence has a sound, and a bird who's known starvation has its ear down to the ground. He thought her wings were broken, that her spirit had been tamed. He forgot that in the silence a brand new song is framed. Julian took a half-step forward, a silent, menacing gesture for me to stop. But I held his gaze, refusing to back down. This was my stage now. He had paid for it himself. I took a deep breath, pouring every last ounce of my pain, my anger, and my newfound freedom into the final verse. My voice soared, filling every corner of the opulent ballroom, no longer a whisper, but a powerful, soaring declaration. This golden cage, it cannot hold a thing it didn't buy, the architect. He owns the house, but he will never own the sky, so thank you for this final stage, this last requested plea. You didn't buy my silence, you only set me free. As the last three words, "set me free," echoed in the vast room, I didn't let them hang with triumph. I let them fall with a quiet, devastating finality. The music faded into a single, sustained, sorrowful note from the cello, and then silence. A profound, deafening silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The air was thick with unspoken thoughts, with the wreckage of a perfectly curated public image. I had not screamed or cried or thrown accusations. I had simply told the truth, wrapped in a melody so beautiful and sad it was impossible to dismiss. I had turned his power play into my emancipation proclamation. I looked at Julian one last time. The mask was gone. His face was a canvas of pure, unadulterated rage and humiliation. His empire had been shaken, not by a rival corporation, but by a girl with a guitar and a story he thought he had buried. Beside him, Isabel slowly, deliberately pulled her hand from his. My work was done. Without a word, without a bow, I turned and walked off the stage, my footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, through the wings, down the back corridor, and out a side door into the cold, clean air. The wind from the lake hit my face, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I could fly. The immediate aftermath was a blur of motion and sensation. I didn't run. I walked, my steps measured and deliberate, out of the estate and down the long gravel driveway. The cold air felt like a baptism, washing away the cloying sweetness of the ballroom's flowers and the suffocating weight of Julian's world. My heart was still pounding, a wild drumbeat against my ribs, but it was the exhilarating rhythm of adrenaline, not the frantic beat of fear. I didn't look back, but I could almost feel the shockwaves emanating from the building behind me. I imagined the frantic whispers, the hasty damage control, the wedding coordinator speaking urgently into her headset. I had just thrown a grenade into the most meticulously planned day of Julian Thorne's life, and the shrapnel would be hitting everyone in that room. My phone, which I'd left in my coat in the staff room, was a dead weight in my pocket. I didn't dare look at it. I didn't need to. I knew it would be a war zone of texts and missed calls. By the time I reached the main road, the grey sky had opened up and a light, misty rain began to fall. It was fitting. I hailed a cab, the driver giving my elegant dress a curious look. "O'Hare," I said, the destination coming to me in a moment of pure instinct. I wasn't going to the airport to flee. I just needed to go somewhere anonymous, somewhere filled with the motion of people moving forward, away from their pasts. I needed to disappear into a crowd. Inside the cab, the quiet was a relief. The city lights smeared across the rain-streaked windows. I finally allowed myself to tremble, a delayed reaction to the immense pressure of the last hour. I hadn't just performed a song, I had detonated my own life, or at least the life Julian had defined for me. What came next was a terrifying, exhilarating unknown. Later that evening, sitting in an anonymous airport bar with a club soda, I finally dared to look at my phone. 117 notifications. Most were from Maya, a frantic string of all-caps texts. "OMG, what did you do? Are you okay? They cut the live feed of the wedding. Call me." There were missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and then there was one, single text from a blocked number. I knew it was from him. My thumb hovered over it, a strange mix of dread and morbid curiosity churning in my gut. I opened it. "You will regret this for the rest of your life." The words were cold, flat, and utterly devoid of emotion. It wasn't a threat made in the heat of passion. It was a promise, a corporate guarantee of my future ruin. A year ago, that text would have shattered me. Now I looked at it, took a slow sip of my drink, and deleted it. He could no longer hurt me with threats of a future he controlled, because I had just taken that control away from him. Over the next few days, the story began to leak, not in a torrent, but in carefully curated trickles. The Thorne and Sterling families were masters of public relations. There was no mention of the incident in the society pages, which ran glowing, generic articles about the fairy tale wedding. But gossip is a weed that grows in the cracks of even the most well-paved facades. Maya became my conduit to the outside world. "Okay, so here's the official story," she reported over the phone a few days later. "The Thorne PR machine is claiming you had a distressing emotional episode on stage. They're spinning it as a tragic, unstable ex-girlfriend moment. They're painting you as delusional and him as the poor, benevolent victim who only tried to help you." "Of course they are," I said, a weary resignation in my voice. "But," Maya continued, her voice dropping conspiratorially, "it's not really working. Too many people were there. A video, a really grainy one taken on someone's phone, is making the rounds in private group chats. You can't make out all the lyrics, but you can hear the music change. You can see the looks on their faces. The story is getting out. And Elara, people are taking your side." That was the part I hadn't expected. I had anticipated being excommunicated, blacklisted, and branded a pariah. And to a certain extent I was. The producers Julian had once introduced me to were suddenly unreachable. The doors he had opened were now firmly slammed and bolted shut. But something else was happening. The video, as grainy as it was, went viral in smaller independent music circles. Bloggers and indie music journalists started writing about the wedding singer who sang her truth. They didn't have all the facts, but they had the core of the story. A powerful man, a silenced artist, and a moment of public rebellion. My name, once whispered only in the context of Julian Thorne, was now being discussed on its own merits. The most shocking development came a week after the wedding. An email appeared in my inbox with the subject line, "From the mother of the groom." My blood ran cold. I expected a tirade, a legal threat, a venomous diatribe from the family matriarch. With trembling hands, I opened it. "Ms. Vance, I am not writing to condone the disruption you caused at my son's wedding. It was a deeply unfortunate and public affair. However, I am also not a fool. I have watched my son operate his entire life. I have seen his ruthless need to win, to control every narrative, to possess everything and everyone in his orbit. What you did was an act of profound courage. It was, I suspect, the first time in a very long time that anyone has told Julian the unvarnished truth to his face, without fear of the consequences. He will try to destroy you for it. Do not let him. That song you sang, it was more than just a song. It was art born from pain. The world needs more of that kind of honesty. Do not contact me again. I wish you well. Eleanor Thorne." I read the email 3 times, the words blurring through my tears. It wasn't an offer of help. It wasn't an alliance. It was something far more valuable. Validation. From the most unexpected source imaginable, it was an acknowledgement that I wasn't crazy. I wasn't delusional. I was telling the truth. Eleanor Thorne had seen her son for who he was. And in that moment of public humiliation, she had seen me too. She hadn't intervened, and she wouldn't. She was loyal to her family, to the empire. But in her own quiet way, she had just confirmed everything. She had witnessed the aftermath, the silent, furious drive home, the shattered bride. She knew the song wasn't an episode. It was a reckoning, and it was long overdue. The months following the wedding were a study in contrasts. On one hand, Julian's promise of my ruin was being quietly, efficiently fulfilled. The mainstream music industry, so intertwined with the kind of corporate money and power the Thorne family wielded, became a fortress I couldn't breach. Every door was closed. My name was poison. To hire Ilara Vance was to invite the wrath of Thorne Industries, and no one was willing to take that risk. The golden cage had been replaced by an invisible wall. But on the other hand, in the cracks and alleyways of that fortress, something new was growing. The grainy cell phone video of my performance, stripped of its original audio and set to a studio version of the song I recorded on my own dime, became an underground anthem. I called the song The Architect. I uploaded it to Bandcamp and YouTube, with no promotion, no label, just a simple title and my name. It found its audience. Women who had been in controlling relationships, artists who had been stifled by patrons, anyone who had ever felt their voice being taken from them, they heard themselves in my story. Emails and comments poured in, not just from Chicago, but from all over the world. They were messages of solidarity, of gratitude for giving voice to their own silent battles. I hadn't just sung my story, I had sung theirs. I used the rest of Julian's fee, my severance package I had started calling it, to rent a small studio space and record an entire EP. The music was raw, stripped down, and unflinchingly honest. It was the album I was always meant to make before Julian had tried to sand down my edges and polish me into something marketable. My big break, however, came from an unlikely source. A woman named Clara, the record executive Julian had claimed rejected me, reached out. She had started her own small independent label in Nashville, focused on authentic singer-songwriters. I saw the video. she said over a Zoom call, her voice warm and direct. And then I heard the architect. Ilara, what my former assistant told you was true. We were ready to sign you 2 years ago. Julian Thorne told us you had quit music. He sent us a forged letter, supposedly from you, turning down our offer. He said you wanted a quiet life out of the spotlight. He killed the deal. Hearing it confirmed, so plainly, was like having the air knocked out of me. It was one thing to suspect it, but another to hear the concrete, brutal truth. Why would he do that? I whispered, the question I had asked myself 1,000 times. Control, Clara said simply. He didn't want to launch you. He wanted to own you. Your success, independent of him, was the one thing he couldn't tolerate. It's the mark of a deeply insecure man, the kind who builds empires to hide the fact that he feels like nothing inside. But he made a mistake, Ilara. He underestimated you. He thought he was burying you, but he didn't realize you were a seed. Clara offered me a record deal. It wasn't a multi-million-dollar contract. There were no lavish perks or fancy apartments, but it was real. It was a partnership. It offered me complete creative control. I signed it without hesitation. A few months later, I was preparing for my first real tour, playing small, sold-out clubs in cities across the Midwest. One night, after a show in Milwaukee, as I was packing up my guitar, a woman approached me. She was older, impeccably dressed, and had a familiar, elegant bearing. It took me a moment to place her. It was Isabel's aunt, a woman I had met briefly at a handful of Thorne family events. "Ms. Vance," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I was at the wedding. What you did was remarkable." "Thank you," I said, wary. "I feel there is something you deserve to know," she continued, her eyes filled with a kind of weary sadness. "About why Julian was so insistent you sing that particular song. It wasn't just about humiliating you." She explained that in the months leading up to the wedding, Isabel had become increasingly insecure about my past relationship with Julian. She was haunted by the idea that I was his great artistic love, and that she was merely a convenient, strategic match. She had found my old demos, including Our Northern Star, and became obsessed with it, playing it over and over. Julian knew this, the aunt said, her voice dropping. He saw her insecurity, and he used it. He convinced her that forcing you to sing your song at their wedding would be the ultimate proof that he was over you, that the song and you meant nothing to him anymore. It would be a performance of his power over his own past, all for her benefit. He turned his cruelty towards you into a supposed gift for her. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. It was a level of psychological manipulation that was almost breathtaking in its complexity and cruelty. He hadn't just been hurting me, he had been manipulating his own fiancée, playing on her deepest fears, all to feed his own ego. The wedding wasn't a merger of two people, it was the hostile takeover of a new soul. "Are they—" I couldn't bring myself to finish the question. "Divorced?" she said with a sharp nod. "Isabel left him 2 months after the wedding. Your song wasn't what broke them, my dear. It was what illuminated the cracks that were already there. You gave her the courage to see the architect for who he really was. You didn't just set yourself free that day." As she walked away, I felt a profound sense of closure. My fight had never truly been with Isabel. It had been with Julian and the suffocating world he represented. In the end, my song had been a key for both of us. My tour took me to Chicago a year to the day after the wedding. I was playing at the Vic, a venue 10 times the size of the Green Mill. The show was sold out. As I stood in the wings, hearing the roar of the crowd chanting my name, I thought about the journey, the eviction notice, the gilded cage, the silent scream that became a song. Taking the stage, bathed in warm, bright light, I looked out at the sea of faces, strangers who felt like friends. They knew my story. They had helped me write the new chapters. I was no longer a ceremony vocalist or a pretty living trophy. I was just Ilara, and I was finally free. I stepped up to the microphone, my vintage Martin guitar feeling like a familiar friend in my hands. I looked out at the crowd, smiled a real, genuine smile, and began to sing. Ilara's story is a powerful reminder that our voices are the one thing no one can ever truly take from us. She walked into her ex's wedding as a victim, a ghost of the past he thought he could control. But she walked out as the author of her own story, a survivor who turned her deepest pain into her greatest power. Her song didn't just expose a toxic man. It sparked a movement of truth and liberation, proving that the most powerful stage is the one you build for yourself. What did you think of Ilara's incredible act of courage? Let us know in the comments below. If her story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more true life stories that will shock and inspire you. What if the most vulnerable moment of your life was interrupted by the one person you never wanted to see again? For Dr. Clara Bellamy, a university professor on the verge of welcoming her first child, that nightmare became a reality. As a sudden life-threatening complication throws her into an emergency C-section, she opens her eyes to a chilling sight. The surgeon holding the scalpel, the man in charge of her and her baby's fate, is Dr. Simon Vance, her ex-husband, the man whose ambition and betrayal shattered her world years ago. What follows isn't just a medical procedure. It's a tense, emotional collision of past and present, where a single decision could mean life, death, or a forgiveness she never thought possible. Stay with us for a story of heartbreak, power, and the incredible act of redemption that no one saw coming. The late September light, golden and thick like honey, streamed through the large bay window of their Chicago brownstone. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny, glittering promise. Dr. Clara Bellamy, a tenured history professor at Northwestern, rested a hand on the swell of her belly, feeling the gentle, rhythmic flutter of the life within. At 36, after years of academic rigor and one spectacularly failed marriage, this was her masterpiece. This was peace. Her partner, Mark, an architect with kind eyes and a steady presence that was the antithesis of everything she'd known before, was assembling the crib in the corner of the newly painted nursery. The walls were a soft, calming sage green. The scent of fresh paint and new wood filled the room, a perfume of new beginnings. Instructions say tab A fits into slot B, Mark grunted, his brow furrowed in concentration. But I'm looking at what appears to be tab Q and a slot shaped like a trapezoid. I think this thing was designed by M.C. Escher. Clara laughed, a full, genuine sound that bounced off the walls. You build skyscrapers for a living, but you're being defeated by Scandinavian flat-pack furniture. It's humbling, isn't it? He looked up, his face breaking into a warm smile that always made her feel safe. Completely. But as long as she has somewhere to sleep by the time she gets here, I'll call it a win. He gestured with a wooden dowel. How are you two feeling? We're feeling content, Clara said, rubbing her stomach. She's a little quiet today, probably exhausted from all the kicking practice she did last night on my bladder. This was their life, a quiet symphony of domesticity and gentle humor. It was a world away from the life she used to live. The old life was a high-stakes opera, full of dramatic crescendos and devastating silences, all orchestrated by one man, Dr. Simon Vance, her ex-husband, a brilliant, ambitious surgeon whose charisma was as sharp as his scalpel and whose capacity for emotional cruelty had nearly broken her. The betrayal hadn't been a simple affair. It was a slow, corrosive neglect, a constant prioritizing of his God-complex career over the simple, sacred vows of their marriage. He had hollowed her out, leaving an empty space where her trust and self-worth used to be. Mark had filled that space, not with noise and drama, but with light and patience. Suddenly, a sharp, searing pain shot through her lower back, so intense it stole her breath. She gasped, her hand flying from her belly to her spine. Mark was on his feet in an instant, his playful demeanor vanishing. "Clara, what is it?" I don't know," she stammered, trying to breathe through the intensity. It wasn't like the Braxton Hicks contraction she'd been having. This was a vicious, tearing sensation. "It's sharp, really sharp." Another wave hit, this one wrapping around her abdomen, squeezing with brutal force. She felt a terrifying wetness, a warm gush that had nothing to do with her water breaking. Her eyes widened in panic as she looked down at the light-colored leggings she was wearing. A dark, crimson stain was spreading rapidly. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Call 911, now." The world dissolved into a blur of frantic motion and panicked voices. The serene nursery, a moment ago a symbol of hope, became the backdrop for a terrifying emergency. Mark's voice was strained as he spoke to the dispatcher, his hand clutching hers, his knuckles white. The paramedics arrived with a controlled urgency that was both calming and horrifying. They spoke in acronyms and medical jargon, their faces grim. As they loaded her onto the stretcher, her eyes locked on the half-assembled crib. The Escher-like puzzle that had been a source of laughter was now a monument to a future that felt, in that moment, terrifyingly uncertain. The pain was relentless, a monstrous thing with teeth. But it was the fear that truly paralyzed her. Fear for the tiny, fluttering life that had been so active just hours ago. Fear for the peaceful world she and Mark had so carefully built on the ruins of her past. The ambulance ride was a chaotic symphony of sirens and beeping monitors. A paramedic was pressing on her abdomen, his voice urgent. "Blood pressure is dropping. We're heading to Chicago Memorial. It's the closest level I trauma center with a top-tier NICU." Chicago Memorial. The name hit Clara like a physical blow, a ghost from a life she had surgically removed from her own. It was the hospital where Simon had built his empire. It was his kingdom, the place she had avoided for 6 long years, even changing her own primary care physician to ensure she never had to set foot inside its gleaming, sterile halls. "No," she croaked, trying to sit up. "Not there. Take me to Prentice, anywhere but there." The paramedic gently pushed her back down. "Ma'am, with this amount of bleeding, we don't have a choice. We have to get you to the best care, and that's Memorial. Dr. Evans' team is on standby." Dr. Evans, a name she didn't recognize, a small, fragile tendril of relief. Simon was a neonatal surgeon, not an obstetrician. The chances of seeing him were slim. He was probably in some high-profile surgery or charming donors at a gala. He wouldn't be anywhere near a routine emergency C-section. He was far too important for that. Clinging to that thought, she let the darkness at the edge of her vision pull her under. The sirens wailed the last sound she heard as her perfect, sun-drenched afternoon shattered into a million terrified pieces. The transition from the ambulance to the emergency room was a jarring ballet of controlled chaos. Bright lights streaked overhead as the gurney rattled through corridors, voices echoing in a disorienting cacophony. Clara was vaguely aware of Mark, his face pale and strained, trying to keep up, his hand reaching for hers whenever he could. She was rushed into a triage room where a swarm of nurses and doctors descended. An ultrasound wand, cold and slick with gel, was pressed against her belly. The doctor, a woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, watched the screen, her lips a thin, tight line. "It's a placental abruption," she announced to the room, her voice cutting through the noise. "A bad one. She's hemorrhaging. We need to get this baby out now. Page Dr. Evans. Tell her we're coming up." Mark clutched Clara's hand. "Is the baby okay?" "The baby's heart rate is decelerating. We have minutes, not hours," the doctor said, not unkindly, but without any sugar-coating. "We need to perform an emergency C-section." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. All their careful birth plans, the doula, the playlist of calming music, all of it incinerated in an instant. She was no longer a participant in this process. She was a vessel in crisis, her body a failing machine. They were moving again, this time towards the surgical floor. The air grew colder, the smells more antiseptic. Mark was stopped at a set of double doors. "I'm sorry, sir," a nurse said gently. "It's an emergency procedure." "You'll have to wait here." The look of pure terror and helplessness on his face was the last thing Clara saw before the doors swung shut, separating her from the one person who made her feel safe. Inside the operating room, the world was a universe of green scrubs and gleaming steel. She was shifted onto a narrow table, her arms strapped down. An anesthesiologist appeared at her head, his voice a low, calming murmur as he explained he was putting her under general anesthesia. "You'll just feel a little prick in your arm and then you'll be asleep. We'll take good care of you." Fear, cold and absolute, washed over her. She was losing control, surrendering her body and her baby to strangers. She closed her eyes, focusing on the image of the sage-green nursery, the half-built crib, and Mark's loving, goofy smile. "Please," she whispered to no one in particular, "please save my baby." The prick in her arm was sharp, followed by a spreading coldness. The bright lights above her began to blur, their edges softening and swirling. The voices around her faded, stretching and distorting as if coming from underwater. She was sinking, falling away into a dreamless void. Time ceased to exist. There was only the blackness. Then, slowly, a sliver of awareness returned. Not sight, but sound. Muffled voices, urgent and sharp. The rhythmic beeping of a machine. A strange sense of pressure on her abdomen. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids were impossibly heavy. Or, "Can't get the bleeding under control. I need more clamps." The voice was distant, professional. "Heart rate is still dropping. We're losing her." Another voice, female. Through the fog of anesthesia, a new voice cut through, one that struck a chord of primal recognition deep within her soul. It was a voice she hadn't heard in 6 years, but one that was etched into her memory, a voice that had once whispered promises in the dark and later delivered devastating clinical excuses. "What's the situation here?" The voice was calm, authoritative, radiating an unnerving confidence that commanded the entire room. "Dr. Vance," the first doctor said, his tone a mixture of relief and deference. "Patient is a G1P0 at 38 weeks, complete placental abruption. Massive hemorrhage. Baby is in severe distress. Dr. Evans was called into another emergency surgery across town. We've been trying to manage." "No, it can't be." Clara's mind screamed, but no sound came out. She fought against the crushing weight of the anesthesia, forcing her eyelids to flutter. The world swam into a blurry, distorted view. She could see green shapes, the blinding glare of the surgical light. And then, a figure moved into her line of sight, standing over her. He was wearing a surgical mask and cap, but there was no mistaking the eyes. They were the color of a stormy sea, intense and piercing, the same eyes that had once looked at her with feigned adoration and later with cold indifference. It was Simon. Panic, so profound it was like drowning, seized her. This was her worst nightmare made manifest, the ultimate power imbalance. She was naked, unconscious, her body literally open on a table, and the man who had systematically dismantled her heart was now holding her life and the life of her child in his hands. He seemed to feel her gaze, his eyes flickering down to meet hers for a fraction of a second. There was no recognition in them. Or if there was, he masked it with an ironclad professionalism. His focus was absolute. "Forget the bleeding for a second. Get that baby out." "Now," Simon commanded. "Give me the scalpel. I'm taking over." He moved with a fluid, terrifying grace. The room, which had felt on the edge of panic, snapped into a new rhythm, orchestrated by his presence. He was in complete control. Clara felt a new series of tugs and pressures. Simon's voice was a low, constant stream of commands. "Suction, more lap pads. What's the baby's heart rate?" "It's bottoming out, doctor, 50 beats per minute." "I'm almost there," Simon muttered, his focus absolute. Clara's consciousness was fading again, the drugs pulling her back under. But before she slipped away, she heard it. A sound that cut through the fear, the drugs, the beeping machines. A tiny, fragile, sputtering cry. Her baby, her daughter, she was alive! And the man who had saved her was the one man she had prayed she would never see again. The ghost of her past had returned, not as a memory, but as a savior, and she had no idea if she or her new life with Mark would survive the collision 6 years earlier. The rain had been relentless that night, lashing against the windows of their sleek, minimalist apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. It was their 4th anniversary. Clara had spent the afternoon cooking Simon's favorite meal, a complex osso buco that took hours to prepare. The table was set with their wedding china, candles casting a soft, hopeful glow. She wore the dress he'd bought her in Florence, a slip of dark blue silk. She waited. At 8 p.m., a text. Surgery running late. Start without me. At 10 p.m., another. Complications. This is a big one. Don't wait up. At 1 a.m., he finally came home. He didn't seem to notice the candles, now melted down to waxy puddles, or the untouched plates of cold food. He was buzzing, high on adrenaline and triumph. You should have seen it, Clara, he'd said, stripping off his scrubs, his eyes alight with a fervor she rarely saw directed at her anymore. An in utero cardiac intervention on a 26-week fetus. Nobody in the Midwest has ever successfully performed it. We published the preliminary data tonight. The board is already talking about naming the new surgical wing after me. He was glowing with the light of his own brilliance, utterly oblivious to the quiet darkness that had enveloped their home. Happy anniversary, Simon, she'd said, her voice flat. He had the grace to look momentarily abashed. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled dark hair. Oh God, Clara, I am so sorry. It completely slipped my mind. This surgery, it was monumental. Everything you do is monumental, she'd replied, the bitterness she'd been swallowing for months finally rising like bile. Our life, our marriage, that's just the boring stuff that happens between your monumental achievements. The fight that followed was the final, fatal tear in an already frayed fabric. It wasn't about the forgotten anniversary, it was about the 1,000 other cuts, the missed birthdays, the cancelled vacations, the way he would look at her, a respected academic in her own right, as if she were a charming but ultimately trivial distraction from his real work, the work of being a god. The betrayal wasn't in another woman's bed, it was in the operating theatre, on the pages of medical journals, in the adoring eyes of his residents. He had pledged his life to her, but he was having a passionate, all-consuming affair with his own ambition. 2 months later, she moved out. The divorce was ruthlessly efficient, just another procedure for him to complete. Now, waking up in the recovery room of Chicago Memorial, the memory felt as raw as the fresh, burning incision across her abdomen. A low groan escaped her lips. "Clara, honey, I'm here." Mark's voice. He was sitting by the bed, his face etched with worry, his hand instantly finding hers. "The baby?" she rasped, her throat dry. "She's okay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She's tiny, but she's a fighter. They took her to the NICU, a girl, Clara. We have a daughter." Tears of relief streamed down Clara's temples. A daughter. Through the haze of pain and memory, a fierce, protective love bloomed in her chest. "What happened?" she asked, her eyes fluttering open. The room was dim, quiet. Mark hesitated, his grip tightening on her hand. "You lost a lot of blood. They said it was very close. For both of you. They had to call in a specialist." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The head of neonatal surgery." Clara's blood ran cold. "Simon, it wasn't a question." Mark nodded, his jaw tight. He took over. "They said he saved her life, Clara. He saved your life." The words were impossible to process. The man who had destroyed her world had just saved everything that mattered in her new one. It was a cruel, cosmic joke. A debt she could never repay, owed to the last person on earth she ever wanted to be indebted to. "I don't want to see him," she said, her voice stronger now, laced with a familiar steel. "You talk to him, Mark. You handle everything. I want him nowhere near me." Of course, Mark said immediately, his loyalty absolute. Whatever you need. But they both knew it wasn't that simple. Their daughter was in the neonatal intensive care unit, and Dr. Simon Vance was its king. Later that afternoon, a nurse wheeled Clara, groggy and sore, to the NICU. The unit was a surreal world of hushed tones, dim lighting, and the soft, constant symphony of monitors. And there, in a small, clear incubator, was the tiniest human she had ever seen, their daughter. She had a wisp of dark hair, a perfect miniature nose, and her tiny chest rose and fell with the help of a ventilator. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She was overwhelmed by a love so powerful it physically hurt. A shadow fell over the incubator. "Her name is Lily," Mark said, his voice tense. He had stood up, placing himself protectively between Clara's wheelchair and the newcomer. Simon stood there, dressed not in scrubs, but in a perfectly tailored suit beneath a crisp white lab coat. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, but he still radiated the same intimidating aura of brilliance and control. He didn't look at Clara. His entire focus was on the tiny baby in the incubator. "Her preliminary scans look good," he said, his voice the same clinical, detached tone she'd heard in the OR. "Lungs are underdeveloped, which is expected. We have her on surfactant and she's responding well. The primary concern right now is monitoring for any signs of HIE, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. Due to the initial distress, the next 72 hours are critical." He spoke directly to Mark, as if Clara wasn't even there. The power play was subtle but unmistakable. He was the expert. They were the grateful, ignorant parents. He was in control. "We'll do everything we can for her," Simon continued, finally allowing his gaze to shift. It swept past Clara, a brief, dismissive flicker, before landing on Mark. "I will be personally overseeing her care." He was marking his territory. He wasn't just the surgeon who had swooped in. He was making it clear he was in charge of their daughter's fate from this moment forward. The man who had treated her heart as a disposable commodity was now the sole guardian of the most precious piece of it. The war she thought she had won 6 years ago wasn't over. It had just moved to a new, terrifying battlefield. The next 3 days were a living hell, a purgatory of beeping machines and forced pleasantries. The NICU became the center of their universe, and Simon was its ruling deity. He moved through the unit with an air of ownership, his team of residents and nurses trailing in his wake like disciples. They spoke of him in hushed, reverent tones, recounting tales of his miraculous surgical feats. To them, he was a savior. To Clara, he was a captor. She and Mark developed a routine. They would spend hours by Lily's incubator, speaking to her in low, soothing voices, reaching through the portholes to touch her impossibly small hand. Clara, still recovering from her surgery, would sit in her wheelchair, her body aching, her heart torn between overwhelming love for her daughter and a simmering rage towards the man in charge of her care. Simon's daily rounds were a masterclass in psychological warfare. He would arrive at the same time every morning, clipboard in hand, and deliver a clinical, jargon-filled update directly to Mark. He treated Clara like a piece of furniture, his eyes sliding over her as if she were invisible. It was a deliberate, calculated cruelty, a way of reminding her of her powerlessness. He was the doctor, the authority. She was just the mother, the patient, the broken woman he had once discarded. Mark, bless him, tried to run interference. He would stand tall, ask intelligent questions, and pointedly refer to Clara for her opinion. "Clara and I were wondering about her oxygen saturation levels," he would say, trying to draw her into the conversation. Simon would simply angle his body slightly, cutting her out of the circle, and answer Mark directly. "We're titrating her oxygen as needed. Her stats are stable for now." The power imbalance was suffocating. In the outside world, Clara was Dr. Bellamy, a woman who commanded lecture halls and published scholarly articles. In this sterile, fluorescent-lit world, she was nothing. Her past with Simon gave him an arsenal of unsaid things, a history he could leverage with a single dismissive glance. He knew her vulnerabilities, her fears, and he was subtly pressing on every one of them. On the third day, the tension reached a breaking point. Dr. Anya Sharma, a kind-faced neonatologist on Simon's team, was checking Lily's vitals. Unlike the others, she spoke to Clara directly, with warmth and empathy. "She's a little fighter, your Lily," Dr. Sharma said, smiling. "She's responding to the treatment even better than we'd hoped." "Thank you, Dr. Sharma. We appreciate you," Clara said, a wave of gratitude washing over her. Just then Simon appeared for his rounds. He overheard the exchange, and a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He began his usual clinical monologue, but this time Mark interrupted him. "Dr. Vance, Clara was just saying—" Simon held up a hand, a gesture of absolute authority that silenced Mark instantly. "What I am about to say is critical, and I need your undivided attention," he said, his voice sharp. He then launched into a complex explanation of a new potential complication, a minor heart murmur they were monitoring. He used dense medical terminology, his explanations clearly aimed at intimidating rather than informing. Clara felt a hot surge of anger. This wasn't about their daughter's care anymore. It was a performance. It was about him reasserting his dominance. When he finished, there was a heavy silence. He looked at Mark, expecting acquiescence. But it was Clara who spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a razor. "Explain it again," she said. Simon's head snapped towards her. It was the first time she had directly challenged him. "I'm sorry." "Explain it again," she repeated, her gaze unflinching. "But this time, use layman's terms. Explain it to me as if I am not an inconvenience, but the mother of the patient whose life you hold in your hands. Explain it to me, Simon." Using his first name was a deliberate shot, a reminder that before he was a god in a white coat, he was a man who had shared her bed and broken her vows. The air in the small space crackled with tension. The junior doctors and nurses standing nearby froze, their eyes wide. No one spoke to Dr. Vance like that. Simon's stormy eyes locked onto hers. The professional mask slipped for a second, revealing a flash of the arrogant, wounded man she knew so well. He was furious. She had challenged his authority in front of his audience. He took a slow, deliberate breath, his jaw clenching. He was weighing his options: dismiss her and look like a bully, or acquiesce and lose a fraction of his power. "The murmur," he began, his voice clipped and tight, his eyes still boring into hers, "indicates a possible patent ductus arteriosus. It's a small vessel near the heart that is supposed to close after birth. In premature infants, it sometimes remains open. If it doesn't close on its own, it can strain the heart and lungs. We are monitoring it. If necessary, we can treat it with medication or, in rare cases, a minor procedure." He had explained it. He had yielded. It was a tiny victory, but it felt monumental. She had clawed back a sliver of control, reminding him, and herself, that she was not just a passive victim in this drama. He turned and strode away without another word, his entourage scrambling to follow. Mark let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked at Clara with awe. Wow. Clara's heart was still pounding. The confrontation had cost her, draining her of precious energy. But as she looked at her tiny daughter, sleeping peacefully in the incubator, she knew it was a battle she had to fight. This was no longer just about her and Simon and their toxic past. It was about her daughter. She would not allow Simon's ego to cast a shadow over Lily's first days of life. She had found her voice again, and she would be damned if she let him silence it. The currency of power in this place wasn't just medical knowledge, it was courage, and she was finally ready to spend it. The confrontation, as small as it was, shifted the dynamic. Simon didn't become warm or friendly. That would have been a miracle beyond even his capabilities, but the deliberate, dismissive cruelty stopped. During his rounds he would still address Mark primarily, but he no longer angled his body away from Clara. He would occasionally, grudgingly, meet her gaze. He answered her questions with terse, clinical precision, but he answered them. A cold, unspoken truce had been declared. This new, fragile peace allowed Clara to focus her energy where it mattered, on Lily. As her own body slowly healed, her world shrank to the few square feet around her daughter's incubator. She learned the different beeps and tones of the monitors, discerning the subtle shifts in Lily's oxygen levels and heart rate. She read stacks of medical journals on neonatology, arming herself with knowledge, her academic mind finding comfort in research and data. She would not be intimidated by jargon again. Mark was her rock. He handled the logistics of the outside world, updating family, managing their home, dealing with the hospital administration, so that Clara could pour all of herself into being by Lily's side. But she could see the toll it was taking on him. He felt like an outsider in this intense drama, a supporting actor in a play that was fundamentally about Clara, Simon, and the child that now connected them. He never complained, but she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped when he thought she wasn't looking. One night, about a week after Lily's birth, Clara couldn't sleep. The phantom pains in her abdomen were sharp, and her mind was racing. Leaving Mark asleep in the uncomfortable recliner in her hospital room, she wheeled herself down the deserted, silent corridors to the NICU. The night shift was a different world. It was quieter, more intimate. Only a skeleton crew of nurses moved like ghosts between the incubators, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the monitors. Clara parked her wheelchair next to Lily's incubator and just watched her daughter sleep. The ventilator had been removed that morning, a major milestone. Now, only a small nasal cannula delivered oxygen. She was so small, so fragile, yet so resilient. "She has your fight." The voice came from the shadows behind her. Clara startled, her head whipping around. Simon was standing there, out of his suit and lab coat, dressed in simple grey scrubs. He looked exhausted, his hair disheveled. The armor of his authority was gone, and for the first time, he just looked like a tired man at the end of a long day. "You shouldn't be here," Clara said, her voice a low whisper. "Your rounds are in the morning." "Couldn't sleep," he said, moving to stand on the other side of the incubator. He wasn't looking at her, only at Lily. "I was reviewing her latest echocardiogram results. The PDA is starting to close on its own. The medication is working." "I read the report," Clara said coolly. "Dr. Sharma gave it to me this afternoon." A flicker of a smile touched his lips, so faint she almost missed it. "Of course you did, Dr. Bellamy, always doing the research." The casual use of her professional title without a hint of sarcasm caught her off guard. In the quiet of the night, with the beeping monitors as their only soundtrack, the tension between them seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a shared singular focus, the tiny child sleeping between them. They stood in silence for a long time, two people from different lives, bound by a history of pain and a present of fragile hope. "Why did you stay?" Clara asked finally, the question that had been nagging at her. "At Chicago Memorial. I heard you had an offer, chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins. That was always your dream." He didn't seem surprised by the question. He continued to watch Lily, his expression unreadable. "Things change." "That's not an answer, Simon." He finally turned his head, and his stormy eyes met hers in the dim light. The weariness in them was profound. "The offer was contingent on me starting last week. I couldn't leave. Not in the middle of this." Clara processed this. He had given up his dream job, the pinnacle of the ambition that had destroyed their marriage. He had given it up for Lily, for her daughter. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He let out a long, slow breath, the sound heavy with unspoken things. "When I walked into that OR," he began, his voice low and raw, "I didn't know it was you. Not at first. All I saw were the stats on the monitor, a mother and a baby, both crashing. It was a clinical problem to be solved, an equation of life and death." He paused, his gaze dropping back to Lily. "And then I saw your face, and for the first time in a very long time, The equation had a name. It wasn't just about winning or publishing a paper or adding another success to my resume. It was different. He looked back at Clara, and for the first time in years, she saw not the arrogant surgeon or the cruel husband, but a glimpse of the man she had once fallen in love with. A man who was brilliant, yes, but also haunted. "I failed you, Clara," he said, his voice thick with a regret that felt genuine, stripped of all artifice. "I failed our marriage. I spent years building an empire of accomplishments, and I didn't realize until it was too late that I had built it on the ruins of my own home. I can't undo that, but I can make sure this little girl gets the best possible start. I owe her that. I owe you that." The confession hung in the air between them, more intimate and revealing than any conversation they'd had in a decade. It wasn't an apology designed to win her back or to absolve him of his sins. It was a simple, stark statement of fact, an acknowledgement of his failure. Clara felt the fortress of anger she had so carefully constructed around her heart begin to crumble, not with a crash, but with a slow, quiet erosion. She looked from this broken, tired man to her sleeping daughter, the child he had not only saved with his hands, but had now sacrificed his ambitions for. The world was not black and white. It was a landscape of infinite, painful shades of grey. Redemption, she was beginning to realize, wasn't a grand, dramatic gesture. It was a series of small, quiet choices. It was staying when it was easier to leave. It was choosing responsibility over glory. It was a tired surgeon, standing in the dark, watching over a child that wasn't his, trying to heal a wound that had nothing to do with a scalpel. Simon's confession in the quiet of the NICU didn't magically erase years of pain, but it did clear the air of its toxic charge. The dynamic between the three adults, Clara, Mark and Simon, settled into a new, complex equilibrium. The overt power plays were gone, replaced by a cautious, functional respect. Simon was still Lily's doctor, his professionalism unwavering, but there was a new undercurrent of humility to him. He started including Clara in the medical discussions as a peer, acknowledging her research and valuing her input. For Mark, this shift was both a relief and a source of quiet anxiety. He was glad the open hostility was over, but he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. He watched the new, strange accord between Clara and her ex-husband with a protective unease. He trusted Clara completely, but he would never trust Simon. He saw the way Simon looked at Lily with a fierce dedication that was part professional, part deeply personal. It was the look of a man trying to atone for his sins, and Mark worried about what that atonement might cost the new life he and Clara had built. One afternoon, Mark was holding Lily, who was finally big enough for kangaroo care, her tiny body nestled against his bare chest. Clara watched them, her heart so full of love it felt like it might burst. The sight of this good, steady man holding their daughter was a perfect, beautiful image of the life she had chosen. Simon entered the room to check on a monitor. He stopped, his gaze falling on Mark and Lily. He didn't say a word, but the look on his face was a complex tapestry of emotions, professional satisfaction, a deep, aching sadness, and something that looked almost like envy. He saw the family he had thrown away, the simple, profound joy he had traded for accolades and prestige. He gave a curt nod and left, the silence he left behind thick with meaning. "He looks at her like he's trying to earn something back," Mark said quietly, his eyes not leaving Lily's sleeping face. "He is," Clara replied, her voice soft. "But it's not from me, Mark. It's from himself." She went to him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders, resting her cheek on the top of his head. "I love you," she whispered. "None of this changes that. You and Lily are my world. He's just a ghost who did a good thing." Mark leaned back into her embrace, his body relaxing. "I know," he said. "It's just hard to see a ghost every day." As Lily grew stronger, the conversations about her going home began. It was a joyful, terrifying prospect. The NICU, once a place of fear, had become a safe cocoon. Leaving its security felt like a leap of faith. On the day before Lily's scheduled discharge, Clara found herself alone with Simon, signing the final paperwork at the nurse's station. It was the first time they had been truly alone since that night in the NICU. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice clear and steady. The words felt inadequate, but they needed to be said. For everything, for saving her, for saving me, for staying. Simon finished signing a form before looking up at her. "There's no need to thank me," he said. "I was doing my job." "No," Clara insisted, meeting his gaze. "You did more than that. The man I used to know would have saved her, written a paper about it, and then flown to Johns Hopkins without a second thought. He wouldn't have stayed." Simon put the pen down, leaning back against the counter. He looked tired, but at peace. "The man you used to know was an idiot. He thought legacy was something you build out of bricks and mortar, out of awards and titles. He didn't realize it's built in moments like this, quiet moments." His eyes flickered towards Lily's room. "That's a real legacy." There was a long silence, filled with the weight of everything unsaid, everything that could never be taken back. "I forgive you, Simon," Clara said. The words came out surprisingly easily, as if they had been waiting just beneath the surface, needing only the right moment to be released. It wasn't a forgiveness that absolved him or erased the past. It wasn't an invitation back into her life. It was something for her. It was the letting go of a heavy, useless weight she had been carrying for 6 long years. It was the final act of closing a door, not with a slam, but with a quiet, decisive click. For the first time, Simon's composure broke. His eyes welled with tears, and he had to look away, his throat working. He cleared it, turning back to her with a look of profound, humbled gratitude. "Thank you, Clara," he whispered. It was a strange, bittersweet moment of closure, a final, peaceful end to the opera of their shared past. They were no longer the warring ex-spouses, the doctor and the patient, the hero and the victim. They were just 2 people, bound by a shared history and a tiny, miraculous girl who had finally found a way to stand on the same piece of ground without it being a battlefield. The next day, Clara and Mark walked out of the main entrance of Chicago Memorial, leaving the ghost of her past behind in its halls. Clara carried their daughter, a tiny, perfect bundle wrapped in a soft pink blanket. The autumn air was crisp and clean, and the sun was bright. As Mark held the car door open, Clara paused and looked back at the imposing glass and steel building. It was no longer a monument to her pain. It was just a hospital, a place where her daughter's life had begun. She got into the car, buckling Lily safely into her car seat. She looked at Mark, his face radiant with happiness, and then at her daughter, who was blinking up at the new, bright world. Her 2 lives, the one that had been destroyed and the one she had so carefully rebuilt, had collided in the most dramatic way imaginable. But they had survived. They were whole. They were going home. The brownstone, once a place of frantic terror, was now a sanctuary of quiet wonder. The sage-green nursery, with its finally assembled crib, was no longer a room of anxious potential, but one of fulfilled promise. The first few weeks at home with Lily were a blur of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and moments of such profound, heart-stopping love that Clara often found herself simply staring at her daughter, tears of joy streaming down her face. The world of Chicago Memorial, of Simon and the NICU, began to feel like a distant, surreal dream. Their life was here, within these 4 walls, a perfect triangle of love and family. Mark was a natural father, his steady, calm presence a perfect balm for a fussy baby and an exhausted new mother. He would walk the floors with Lily at 3 a.m., his low, rumbling voice humming lullabies, a silhouette of unwavering devotion against the moonlit window. Clara fell in love with him all over again, a deeper, more grounded love than she had ever known. About a month after they brought Lily home, a package arrived. It was a small, flat box with a return address from a high-end children's boutique. There was no note inside, only a beautiful sterling silver rattle intricately engraved with a single flower, a lily. Clara knew instantly who it was from. Her first instinct was a prickle of annoyance, a feeling that he was overstepping, trying to insert himself into a life where he no longer belonged. But as she held the cool, heavy silver in her hand, she saw it for what it was. Not an intrusion, but a quiet, final gesture. A goodbye. She didn't tell Mark about it. Not out of secrecy, but because it felt like a private, final piece of correspondence between her and her past. The rattle belonged to an old story, and their story now was about moving forward. She placed it in Lily's memory box, a memento of the man whose complex, flawed humanity had, against all odds, given their family its beginning. Life found its new rhythm. Clara eventually returned to her work at the university, finding a new perspective in her lectures on social movements and power dynamics. She had lived through her own personal drama of power, vulnerability, and the reclamation of self, and it informed her teaching with a new depth of empathy. One rainy spring afternoon, nearly a year later, Clara was pushing Lily in a stroller through Lincoln Park. Lily, now a bubbly, curious toddler with a mop of dark hair and her father's kind eyes, pointed at a squirrel, babbling with excitement. As Clara bent down to adjust Lily's hat, she heard a familiar voice nearby. "And the funding for the new research protocol is secure." She looked up. Across the path, Simon was walking with another doctor. He looked different. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a comfortable sweater and slacks. The intense, driven energy that had always surrounded him had softened, replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful air. He laughed at something his companion said, a genuine, relaxed sound that Clara hadn't heard in years. Their eyes met across the path. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. All the history, the pain, the drama, the forgiveness, it all flashed between them in a single, silent moment. Simon's gaze dropped to the little girl in the stroller, and his face broke into a small, gentle smile. It was not the smile of a king surveying his work, but of a man witnessing a simple, beautiful miracle. He gave Clara a single, respectful nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, of closure, of peace. Clara nodded back, and then he turned and continued on his walk, his moment in their lives officially over. He was no longer the villain of her story, nor the savior. He was simply a man who had once been a defining, destructive force in her life, and who, through a crucible of fate, had become an unlikely instrument of its greatest joy. He had found his own redemption, not in a grand public spectacle, but in the quiet legacy of a life saved, an ambition tempered, and a past finally laid to rest. Clara looked down at her daughter, who was now trying to share her soggy biscuit with a bewildered pigeon. She laughed, scooping Lily into her arms and holding her tight. The ghost was gone. The past was settled. The future, this beautiful, messy, ordinary, extraordinary future, was all that mattered. The sun broke through the clouds, scattering light across the damp leaves, and Clara walked on, her heart full, her world complete, moving forward into the quiet, brilliant light of her own, hard-won peace. And so Eleanor's story comes to a close. It's a powerful reminder that our deepest wounds often come from those we once loved, but also that redemption can be found in the most unexpected places. Julian's incredible act wasn't just a single heroic surgery. It was the slow, painful and quiet decision to sacrifice his own ego for the life he had once helped to break. It's a story about how the past never truly leaves us, but that we can choose how much power it has over our present. What did you think of Julian's path to redemption? Was his sacrifice enough to atone for his past? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a deep emotional journey. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Thank you for watching.